Hello, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about a subject that, well, there's two common ideologies, and right now there's a lot of literature on one side, but there's a certain individual that is challenging that, and that perhaps there might be a middle ground. But so what we're going to tackle here is the drink to thirst ideology or the drink to schedule ideology, specifically talking about exercise hydration. Um, so, drink to thirst basically means that you're going to drink when you feel thirsty, and it's pretty simple. Or you're going to drink to a schedule, which would be drinking every 5, 10, 15 minutes, so on and so forth. And they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and it's dependent really upon what type of drink you choose. So before we get into talking about the drinks and the ideologies behind them, we gotta fill you in on the challenges of exercise and why we need to hydrate during exercise. Well, some of the challenges of exercise with regards to hydration and nutritional demands are that with exercise, we increase the amount of heat being produced. So, anytime our metabolic rate increases, our heat production is going to increase. It is a byproduct of internal combustion or a lack of, we're not 100% efficient at converting food into biousable form of energy. Um, so there's always going to be heat that is produced as a consequence. And during exercise, our metabolic rate is going to increase along with an increase in muscular contractions, which are going to dramatically increase the amount of heat produced beyond just resting metabolism. So the problem with producing a lot more heat is that our bodies are very comfortable at a temperature of around 98.6. So that is what is called our normal body temperature or our homeostatic body temperature, 98.6 or around 98.6. Not everybody's going to be identical to 98.6, but around that temperature. And what happens is when our core temperature becomes elevated from exercise, our bodies are going to want to seek a way to bring us back to 98.6 or attempt to bring us back to 98.6. Because obviously during exercise, we're going to stay at an elevated temperature. But our bodies are going to attempt to bring us back to 98.6 to what's called a steady state core temperature. So how do our bodies do this? Well, first of all is via evaporation of sweat. That is the primary way our bodies cool, is by sweating and the evaporation of sweat. You see, our heat within our bodies is carried around via our circulatory system, and in the circulatory system is blood or plasma volume. All right, and that sweating, the fluid that comes, or which is called sweat, which comes from plasma itself. And so when you start sweating to fend off the additional heat production and the threat to normal core temperature, you will start to lose plasma volume. So this phenomenon is called dehydration, right? The reduction in body fluid, and primarily comes from a decrease in plasma volume via sweating, right? The problem with a decrease in plasma volume, looking at from a exercise performance perspective, and not just a survival perspective, is that we'll have an increase in relative heart rate. Well, at submaximal intensities, this may not be a big deal, right? But at maximal intensities, in other words, VO2 max, it is going to be a big deal, and your VO2 max will decline from a decrease in plasma volume. simply being your heart can't beat any faster than its maximal rate, but your heart is going to be pumping less blood because you're going to be losing some of the plasma or the fluid constituent via sweat. All right. This also leads to an increase in thermal strain. Um, in other words, it just feels hot. You just feel hot. It's not comfortable. And what goes along with an increase in thermal strain is an increase in perceived exertion. So the problems are not just associated with increased heart rate, decrease in VO2 max, but also that an increase in thermal strain and perceived exertion can cause you to prematurely fatigue from a mental perspective. You might just quit because it's just the suffering is too great, the perceived exertion is too great. All right, so these are some of the factors which can lead to a decrease in performance with regard to a decrease in plasma volume. Unfortunately, sodium ions follow wherever water goes in our body. Sodium ions tend to follow. So when we sweat and we lose plasma, what tends to follow that fluid is sodium ions. And so, and there's really not a lot of the other electrolyte. It's primarily sodium that's lost in sweat. And we can lose up to 2.2 grams per liter of sweat, and hence we can lose up to 4 liters per hour of sweat. I'm sorry, 2.2 grams of sodium per liter of sweat and 4 liters per hour of sweat. So if you want to do the quick math, that's 8.8 grams per hour of sodium that we can lose. And this is not typically the case of cyclists or runners. More so, it's going to be those who do not are not subject to good evaporative cooling. In other words, they're wearing a lot of equipment, like football players, and they're not moving around at great velocities. Cyclists and runners run around, move around quicker typically than football players, especially like linemen and so on and so forth. So you have an increase in evaporative cooling just from the increased velocity of movement from running and cycling, particularly cycling. So you're not going to see really 8.8 grams lost per hour during cycling, but certainly these can approach, in the 3 to 4 grams, which is a problem because you're not going to see any drinks on the market that can sufficiently replace that much sodium. So what happens when we lose lots of sodium? Well, all you guys are familiar with electrolyte-induced cramping, right? So increase in sodium, a loss in sodium could cause an electrolyte imbalance and cause you to cramp, all right? It also, with a loss in plasma or body sodium, it causes that balance between sodium and potassium, the two opposing ions which keep water balance in check, becomes shifted in favor of potassium. And what that does is that causes fluid to shift, and instead of being a normal balance in the extracellular space and intracellular, is that we have a shift from our extracellular space into our cells or intracellular space, and the cells will start to swell. This is of a particular problem with regards to our brains, because our brains are in a confined space, and any swelling can increase pressure on all the little blood vessels in our vein and therefore decrease nutrient delivery to our brain, and one of those being oxygen. And so, any kind of significant brain swelling not only cause headaches, but cause you to pass out, and if it's severe enough, die. People have died, okay? So it is of vital importance in terms of performance and survival that we replace both the fluid and the sodium. And here's a kicker. Trained endurance athletes sweat more. When you start training, you will start to sweat earlier, and you will start to sweat more often. So trained endurance athletes actually lose more sweat. And so for them, not only because they can increase heat production to a sustainable level beyond, an untrained person, but also that they sweat more, it becomes even more vital that they keep up with uh, staying hydrated and replacing that sodium. Well, one of the other things that our bodies do in a fight to maintain a normal body temperature is vasodilate our peripheral veins. And um, this isn't such a big deal in terms of fluid replacement, right? Because we're replacing water, we're replacing sodium here, and this really doesn't have much to do with it, but I will tell you why it does. Is that when we get hot, our peripheral veins, or those veins that are you see located near your skin, get bigger. And that's because they're increasing the heat being delivered to your skin. Again, remember, heat is uh, transported around our bodies via our blood. And so if we can get that blood closer to the surface area of our skin, we can remove some of that heat via convective or conductive means. So in addition to evaporation, convection and conduction can remove some of that heat, all right? Well, the problem with having more blood in your veins near your skin is you have less blood being delivered to your muscles. And that means at a submaximal intensity, your heart rate will be increased, and at a maximal intensity, your VO2 max will drop. Okay, so these are some of the problems associated with being hot and sweating and losing sodium. They're not good in terms of performance and could even be life-threatening. One of the other challenges of exercise is sheer replenishment of energy, and where we get this energy is via foodstuffs. And foodstuffs, we think about carbs, we think about protein, we think about fat, and that's basically where it comes from. So in terms of carbs, ultimately, we're going to get those carbs in terms of to our muscles as glucose, and in terms of fat, will be fatty acids. In terms of protein, it will be amino acids, the building blocks, um, and there's other things such as ketones. But during high intensity exercise, the primary substrate or food substrate is carbohydrates or glucose. And so what happens is that our muscles start depleting some of that stored energy and converting it into biousable form of energy to keep up muscular contractions, to keep up cycling, to keep up running, to keep up exercising. What happens is that we're burning through a glycogen and we're delivering glucose to our muscles via our blood or our plasma. Okay? Excuse me. And that as our plasma glucose starts to drop, what happens is that our muscles have to burn through more glycogen. And you guys have all heard about the dreaded bonk, right? Well, that happens when your glycogen is depleted. So it is essential to minimize glycogen depletion to maintain blood glucose or delivery of carbohydrates to your muscles outside of the muscles themselves. All right, so it's like feeding an auxiliary fuel source is going to keep your own fuel tank from being depleted fast. Kind of like maybe you can think of it as a hybrid energy system, that we can use some of that electric energy, we don't have to use as much gas. All right, so by feeding it an alternate fuel source out of our blood, we can reduce the amount of glycogen that's burned by our muscles. We can reduce the amount of glycogen that's turned over by your liver. And therefore, at the end of the day, at the end of the exercise session, you'll have more glycogen in your muscles and you'll be able to exercise harder at the end versus bonk. All right? And that ultimately may mean that you're able to get more out of your training session, or you may be able to set new PRs, or you might win a race, so on and so forth. All right, so it is essential that we keep our plasma glucose stabilized, or try to keep our plasma glucose stabilized to spare muscle glycogen. All right. And again, so if we look at the other substrates, plasma and muscle fatty acids, um, we don't really need to supplement with fatty acids or amino acids during exercise. Um, Again, as the exercise intensity gets higher and higher, we are going to shift to using almost exclusively carbohydrates, all right? And that where fatty acids come into play is during lower intensity exercise, and that if we can use some of those fatty acids, that it's going to spare some of the carbohydrates, because during submaximal exercise intensities, we're going to use a mixture of both, all right? But here's the take-home method, all right? We are not in crisis in terms of running out of fatty acids. There are plenty of fatty acids in your adipose tissue, okay? I'll give you an example. You take a 200-pound individual. That 200-pound individual is 10% body fat. That means they have 20 pounds of body fat. Well, there's 3,500 kcals or calories in a pound of body fat. So that ultimately means there's 70,000 kcals or calories of energy in that person's body fat tissue. And during exercise, we never, or any type of resting metabolism, we never exclusively metabolize fatty acids. So it's always a mixture. So that's 70,000 kcals or calories of fatty acids is actually a lot more, because we're going to be using some carbohydrates along with that. So what that means is that really you would have to burn through, 100,000 kcals um, uh, of food energy in order to affect this this person's, this 200-pound individual's adipose tissue and effectively run out of fatty acids. So the only exceptions to this would be in terms of if you're close to essential body fat, 3% for men, and that would be 12% for women. And then you need to analyze your diet. But in terms of exercise performance, there's no scientific literature that suggests that on the bike or on the run, supplementation of fat can increase exercise performance over carbohydrates alone. All right, again, at maximal exercise intensities, whether you're feeding fat into your bloodstream, whether you're feeding amino acids into your bloodstream, whatever, your body's going to want to use carbohydrates, because we can convert that into ATP or muscular contractions and exercise performance at a faster rate. We are more efficient at burning carbs.